So in today's web dev tip, we're going to start taking a look at generics in TypeScript, and we're going to do this by examining how promises work. So we're going to have a quick example of how you might construct a function that uses a promise, and then we'll see how you can type the response using a generic format. So let's first of all create a simple function as if you were going to send a HTTP response. So let's just create something called make HTTP call, for example. And we'll use the fetch API because that actually does return us a promise. So we might do something like this. We might say fetch a particular URL, and that URL could be provided as an argument to this function. So we'll say the URL is a string. And what we'll find from the return type of this function at the moment is that the call to fetch actually returns us a promise that has been typed with a response type. So that response object that's inside of the angle brackets just after the promise keyword, that is the type of data that's going to be inside of a fulfilled promise. And we'll actually change that because what we actually really want from a request to fetch is the actual JSON response. Not all the time, but in this case, using that as an example. And you'll find now that the promise type inside of the angle brackets is actually now as any, because there's no way for the fetch API to know the type of data that's going to be inside of that JSON object. It'll be whatever data has been returned from the server. So we can actually type that ourselves, and this is leading on to how you start to use generics and create generic functions for yourself. So let's say we create an interface of API data or something similar, which might have an ID of string and maybe a username, which is also a string. And going on from the previous examples that we've had, maybe we've got a list of skills, which is also an array of strings. So if we were to actually try and use this make HTTP call function here, and let's just put it in a dummy URL. So just say localhost, for example. When we actually hook into the then function from it, or if we're using the await keyword, we could store it in a variable, of course, as well. So the response that we get here will be actually untyped. So you can see if we hover over the response that's inside of the then block, you can see that the response type is any, in the same way that the promise returns an any type here. So if we're trying to access the response object, for example, we're not going to have access to all of the IntelliSense and the information about the response from that particular call. So the way to do this with generics is to make sure that we're telling TypeScript that this is going to return a promise, this make HTTP call function, but we can actually tell it what type of data the promise will return. So if we know that the API call in here is going to return us this type of interface, this type of data, then we can just use the angle brackets and say API data is the interface that it will return. And then now inside of this then block, when we're actually making the HTTP call, we can access all of the properties that are inside of the interface from the return data. So hopefully all of that made sense. We're creating a function here which returns a promise, but we're actually typing the type of data that the promise returns so that when we actually use it and hook into the actual promise itself, we can access the typed data to ensure that we're accessing the right properties and the right data types within the response from the call. So we'll do a follow-up on this tutorial tomorrow so you can actually see how you can create your own generic types, which will make this HTTP call a bit more flexible. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.